Recording,
Go
and
ahead.
let me share now my screen. Okay, I want to say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the third quarter EduTalks webinar hosted by the Quality in Education Think Tank, or QIETT, of the International Academy for Quality, or IAQ. My name is Ray, and I'm honored to serve you today as a member of QIETT and your host for today as well. So before we start, I'd like to remind everyone that you can use the chat box to share any questions that you may have, any insights or takeaways while our speaker is delivering her talk. So we encourage you to be active and be engaged throughout our session. The IAQ is dedicated to advancing quality practices globally in our think tank, chaired by Dr. Cameron Musa and co-chaired by Dr. Matthew Barsalo, focuses on enhancing quality in education. And today's EduTalks is really part of our ongoing efforts to share innovative practices and insights with educators and quality professionals worldwide. And before we move forward, we wanna hear maybe a quick message from you, Dr. Cameron.
Yes, welcome from my side as well on behalf of the Quality in Education think tank. This think tank is part of the think tank of International Academy for Quality, and it's been involved in research. Recently, a group of people, is from about, I think, correct me, Ray, if I'm not wrong, about 16 countries or 18 members are there in the group from different part of the country, of the world. And their research work is currently under review. We also have annual online symposium which we carry out, and we hold this Edu Talk. Is this my or this somebody's? So we hold a quarterly Edu Talk. We invite experts from around the world to talk on different topics. And we regularly have global dialogue on the issue of quality in education. However, today our EduTalk is on Six Sigma in education, a novel topic. And we have a very special guest with us, who's also a member of Quality in Education think tank. Dr. Elizabeth Cudney is a professor of data analytics and program coordinator for data analytics in the John Simons School of Business at Maryville University. She received her BS in Industrial Engineering, Master's in Mechanical Engineering, and MBA, and doctorate in Engineering Management from University of Missouri. She received 2020 Walter Messing Book Prize from the International Academy for Quality for her book on Lean Six Sigma. In 2018, Dr. Cudney received the ASQ Crosby Medal for her book on Design for Six Sigma. Dr. Cudney received the 2018 IISE Fellow Award. She also received the 2017 Yoshio Kondo Academic Research Prize from International Academy for Quality for sustained performance in exceptional published work. In 2014, Dr. Cudney was elected as an ASEM Fellow, and in 2013, Dr. Cudney was elected as an ASQ Fellow. She was inducted in the International Academy for Quality. She received 2008 ASQ Feigenbaum Medal and 2006 SME Outstanding Young Manufacturing Engineering Award. Her list is very long, and I like to welcome an honorable Dr. Cudney to talk to us on a very special topic. Over to you, Beth.
All right. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. This is a topic of something that, I've obviously been working on for quite some time as an educator and as a quality professional. We practice what we preach, right? In terms of how we improve our education. And hopefully you can see my screen now.
Yes, it's visible.
Yes. Okay. Perfect. Great. I just got a new laptop, so I always have to double check. And so today what I want to talk about is how I've used Lean Six Sigma principles for redesigning curriculum within higher education. And more specifically, I'm going to talk about a case study where, as I've redesigned the entire graduate program that I'm responsible for, I oversee the master's in data analytics, which really ties in quality and Lean Six Sigma, kind of the quality 4.0 aspect. And now we're talking about quality 5.0 as well. But using that information to really make sure that we're designing a program that's relevant to the workforce. So one of the tools that I'll tie in and talk quite a bit about is actually more competency-based learning and how that's useful in higher education in particular to prepare students for the workforce and also be a student-centered design. So for those of you, and I'm sure most of you are in some form of education, if not higher education, COVID brought about quite a few changes when it came to higher education. Many students are used to having a lot more flexibility, and particularly within my program, the program that I'm responsible for, as a graduate level master's program, it is taken by students really throughout the United States and throughout the world. And so making sure that the program is designed in such a way that it's accessible and flexible for our learners. So it's not the traditional undergraduate student by any means that's sitting in the classroom. These are students that are working professionals, traveling for work, that have families. And so, we really need to make sure that they're getting the most out of the education that they're paying for while making sure that it's as flexible as possible. So to do that, I've used Lean Six Sigma as an approach to really design the entire curriculum, and then in particular, one of the courses that I'll focus on today. So what I'd like to talk about today is start by introducing competency-based learning, or CBL. For those of you that may not be as familiar with it, talk about the key components of CBL, the benefits of CBL, how it's implemented, and then I'll focus the majority of my talk today is really on the case study and how I've introduced this concept into the program, and then share some implementation challenges of how this is done. So first, let's talk a little bit about competency-based learning. Competency-based learning has really been around since studies point it back to about 1948, but we'll say kind of mainly the 1950s and 1960s, where there was really a push, particularly in secondary education and high school levels, to really focus on what are those competencies that students really needed to demonstrate and master. And so since that time, it's slowly grown more and more into higher education, but it really focuses on mastering skills and competencies. And with this methodology, it really emphasizes the learning outcomes and how students are going to achieve those specific skills and knowledge. So when we talk about that, it's really about those core competency skills that you want your graduates to have when they graduate, whether it's, if you're talking about secondary education in high school, or from a college perspective like today, what do we want those graduate students to complete their master's degree in and be able to demonstrate mastery within specific core areas or those competencies. So when we talk about competency-based learning and mastery learning, we're really looking at making sure we have measurable and very explicit competencies. And that's easier, I think, to do from the higher education standpoint, because as we look at our graduates, we have employers that want to hire our students based on very specific skills. So if you go to Glassdoor, Indeed, or look at any job applications, our job postings, companies are working for clearly defined skills. And those are the skills, and in my case, for data analysts, what are those skills that the employers want so that they're ready to hit the ground running as soon as they graduate? And so taking that information into programs and having very explicit competencies that we're going to teach our students. With that, we also have to have very clear outcomes and rating systems or rubrics so that we can evaluate our students on whether or not they've mastered those skills. Part of competency-based learning, though, is because students come from a wide range of backgrounds, we need to also have flexibility in our programs. So we'll talk a lot about the difference between kind of more traditional education and competency-based learning, because we're going to have more differentiated and timely self-paced learning so that students that are already very familiar with a certain competency can go ahead and move ahead, and they can focus their time and efforts on where they need to really focus their skills and enhance their learning. And how we set up our assessments, we also want to make sure that we're providing very meaningful, positive assessment and giving them feedback. So it really drives more of a personalized learning so that they can reach that point where they've mastered certain topics. And when they've mastered those topics, then they move on to the next topic, right? So it's very much not a one-size-fits-all model that more of the traditional educational programs use. And one of the reasons that I'm kind of going to jump a little bit ahead to the case study is introduce you to my program, in that a lot of the graduate programs in particular, you'll see students coming from a wide variety of backgrounds. And they're pursuing graduate degrees because they either need a piece of paper because they've been doing this job for 20, 30 years. And in my case, maybe they're a data analyst that's been working for 20 years, but now they need that graduate, that master's. So they've got that credential, but they've already mastered a lot of these skills. Or I've got someone that's completely brand new to the field of data analytics, and all of these competencies are brand new. So we've got to tailor these programs to really this wide range of students and make sure everybody's successful and everybody's getting the most out of this graduate program. So it's a very different approach to really try not to have that one size fits all. Yes, and that's a great, sorry, I'm checking the chat as we go. So this all relates back to Bloom's taxonomy. So everything that we're going to do relates back to Bloom's taxonomy. So I will definitely get to that. So when we talk about the principles of competency-based learning, there's 5 really key principles: mastery, personalization, flexibility, learner-centered, and transparency. So when we talk about mastery, this is where students have to demonstrate a high level of understanding and skill in each competency before they move on to the next. So part of this ties in nicely to the comment from the chat, is when we talk about mastery, we've got to design these programs based on the competencies students need to have, but it has to be based off of also on Bloom's taxonomy, right? So do we need certain topics covered at the basic understanding, remember level? And there's other concepts that they need to be able to apply those, right? And the mastery is really in terms of the skill, right? So great question, Mohsen. Because we want students to be ready to go and hit the ground running with that new job. And so we'll talk a little bit about, Samra's got a great question there about scores and how they correlate and assure mastery, because that's all in how we measure and we prepare our assessments to make sure that they all match, right? And so when we talk about personalization, that's making sure our learning experiences are really tailored to meet the individual needs of the students, their strengths, and their interests, right? We want students to be engaged in the topics. And so one of the things that we've done throughout my program is students pick their own data sets, right? So they're engaged, they're involved, and they're really curious about that area. So it helps get them more engaged in the process. With flexibility, that's how we set it up, where students have a self-paced approach. They can progress at their own pace, so they can accelerate in areas that they feel very comfortable and they've already mastered, whether they're they've been working in this field for a while, or if they need more time because this is a brand new topic for them. And so we're going to provide additional support where it's needed based off of where our students need to have that additional help. From the learner-centered perspective, that's really making sure that we're focusing on the learner's needs, their preferences, right? As educators, we know everyone doesn't learn the same way, right? And so typically, though, hands-on application is really how we're going to get students to be able to be active in the learning process. So we're getting away from the traditional, quizzes and tests and focusing more on applying that knowledge. And so it's in areas that they're very, very interested in, right? And then as part of this is the transparency so that students have a clear and measurable learning outcomes, that they know what they're being measured against and they know those competencies. They're communicated to students ahead of time. So as they're working on projects, they see those rubrics, they see exactly how they're going to be assessed based off of Bloom's taxonomy for each competency that we're going to be measuring. So some of the core aspects of competency-based learning is really the competencies. And so it's the skills, the knowledge, the behaviors that we want our students to be able to demonstrate, right? So I'm seeing a couple of questions about that in the chat. When we talk about those competencies, one of the things I'll talk about in the case study, and I don't want to jump too far ahead, is you really have to know what those competencies are based off of what industry expectations are. And we'll then be able to define like how explicit those competencies are and working with industry professionals, understanding what level those competencies need to be, right? And then we design our assessments so that students can demonstrate how they've met those competencies. And then our rubrics show us to what level, right, of mastery that they've achieved each of those competencies. And then the other key part of this is really making sure it's a personalized learning path. So we need to tailor the educational plans to each student. And again, not to jump too far ahead, but to give you kind of an idea about this is, for example, my program in data analytics, since it's a very hot topic right now. So I have students that are coming from insurance companies where they've got to analyze a lot of data, healthcare organizations because they're doing more of that, the healthcare analytics, manufacturing companies. I've had people from primary and secondary education. So they're coming from so many different paths that I can't just give them a set data set and expect them to be as engaged in it, right? So coming up with ways to personalize what is the best fit for them and giving them really the opportunity to select data sets that are going to be engaging and meaningful for them. So when we talk about that, this is where competency-based learning is really important because it's going to address the diversity of learning needs from different students, right? Competency-based learning really recognizes that students learn at different paces and they learn in different ways. And we have to be able to think about, as we set up a competency-based learning course, how our students are going to learn. But then we're also going to talk later about continuous improvement because as our students are learning, we're going to realize that we didn't hit the mark the first time. So this is all about continuous improvement in our courses as well. And, great question in the comment right now too about, excuse me, some students learn more from a kinesthetic, auditory, visual, right? As we go through and we look at assessments and we get questions from students, we're continuously evolving this course, adding more detail, updating assignments and assessments so that we're now meeting a broader range, right? So, the best laid plans are great, but we continuously learn from our students and evaluate their assessments and then adjust the curriculum accordingly. So by doing that, that allows us to continuously enhance really the personalized learning experience for our students. It also helps prepare our students for the future because they're learning relevant skills that we've gotten from industry, right? And we brought into the classroom, and they're working on more project-based. So they're demonstrating their mastery, their knowledge in those areas, and they're using practical application of that knowledge to really demonstrate those skills. The other part is it really enhances educational equity because students can really focus on the mastery, and that's how students are going to succeed, right? Once they've mastered a skill, they've applied it to an actual hands-on project. This is a tangible project then that they can show future employers. So one of the things that, again, it's kind of hard not jumping ahead with a case study, but starting in the very first course of our program now, students are creating a portfolio of all of their projects so that when they go to apply for jobs, they have a link to a professional portfolio that they can send employers. And if they're getting asked about, well, what have you done with SQL, right? Or show me your work in data visualization with Power BI or Tableau, they can send them a link and they can show an actual real world case study that they've implemented and show that they've mastered this topic with a beautiful dashboard that's integrated, that's, you know, real time, that's doing all these really cool data visualizations to answer a question. And they've shown how they've interpreted that data and they've made recommendations on what they should do with it, right? Because we know when we prepare our students for work in the real world, industry wants to hire professionals that can't just create a dashboard. They can take that information and they can make recommendations, right? So that next level, so back to Bloom's taxonomy, that cognitive domain, it's really about then that next step of not just creating content or analyzing data and coming up with some great charts and graphs. It's the interpretation and making the recommendations then to employers. So we really want to kind of get to that next level so that our students are the best prepared. So the impact of competency-based learning is really more improved student engagement. If students are selecting their own data set, right, that's a great way of making sure that they're engaged. They picked a topic, right? I didn't say just go analyze this data set and have at it. We really want to have a better alignment between the education and what they're working on and the workforce requirements based on the industry that they want to go into, right? And so it's really resulted in higher levels of student achievement and satisfaction because it's a lot more meaningful in terms of what they're working on. So I want to talk kind of briefly about the difference between competency-based learning and traditional learning. With competency-based learning, we'll start with, and I've got a few slides on this, but the first I want to talk about is more of the personalized learning paths versus the standard curriculum. So with competency-based learning, it's more about tailoring the learning experiences to meet the individual needs of the students. The learning pathways then are going to be more customized based on where students, they already are really strong in a certain area, that they don't need to focus that much time on it, right? So we might need to check and assess whether they've mastered that topic, but they can do that pretty quickly. We want them to focus their time and efforts on where they have some weaknesses, right? That's where we can build up their mastery, take the time and really help students, and then also really focus on their interests to help them. Whereas in traditional learning, if I've got a traditional 16-week college course, I've got to hit certain topics, and this week might be focused on a certain topic, and we've got to get through the content in this week, right? So if you're struggling and this is where you need to focus your time, that may not be enough time for you, right? And if this is something that you've been doing in industry for 20 years, this week is really boring you, where you could be focusing on another topic like AI that you really want to advance. So there's not as much flexibility to really accommodate students based on their different learning styles and the paces that they need. In terms of assessment methods as well, With competency-based learning, we're going to focus more on formative assessments, not as much on summative assessments, right? So we want real-world application. We want ongoing feedback. And so students are going to demonstrate their competencies more based on projects, presentations, and practical tasks. The other key part that I want to talk a little bit more about is with competency-based learning, you're going to have students submit a project, you're going to give them feedback, and you're going to let them go and rework that project as many times as possible, right? It's all part of that mastery process. So you're not just submitting a project once. So let's say you submit a big project, right? So you've taken a data set and you've created, dashboard and Power BI based on whatever question you want to answer with that data, right? I'm going to give you feedback on it and say, well, this chart may not be as appropriate because you're looking at data over time. So you might want to use something more with a run chart to show that trend. And maybe you want to add some, data labels to your chart, change up the colors so it's more accessible from a diversity, DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion standpoint, because we realize that, about 8% of males are colorblind. So I'm going to give you feedback on what you've submitted. You're going to go back and you're going to work on it again, and you're going to resubmit it. So maybe you got an 83 the first time. Now you've resubmitted it, you've made some improvements, and I've got some more feedback for you, right? And you're going to maybe resubmit it a third time until you get a project that has really mastered all the concepts. So from an instructor standpoint, it changes really what our role is we're trying to get you to that mastery standpoint of continuous learning and continuous improvement versus traditional learning where you're doing more summative assessment, standardized tests and exams, right? It's very hard to give a lot of personalized feedback based on a standardized test, right? And we're not going to focus in competency-based learning more on memorization, theoretical knowledge. If you have the theoretical knowledge, we really want you to be able to apply it, right? So you have to have that, but the more the focus is on the actual application and the how-to. Because again, when you graduate, this is what industry wants, right? We really want students to be able to hit the ground running. So it's very important that we're giving that formative assessment and that continuous feedback. So it's all that circle of continuous improvement, right? So as quality professionals, we get that, right? This is what we should be doing. So that does change our role as educators because we act then more as facilitators of that knowledge. We're mentoring, we're guiding students through that personalized learning journey, right? We're providing very individualized support and feedback based on the data that they selected because it's of interest to them, and then how they're presenting that information and coming up with their conclusions and their recommendations for moving forward. So we're getting away from the traditional learning standpoint because assessment really is not a one-size-fits-all manner. So there's less emphasis really in a lot of ways in traditional learning on personalized guidance and mentoring, right? And I'll kind of stop here for a second and say, I mean, these are kind of more generalized statements that I'm making in a lot of cases. And this is more kind of towards my program of, what my students need as a graduate program, right? In terms of that feedback and assessment and making sure, right? And it's very different versus maybe I've never worked in primary education. So I'll kind of put that as a caveat. So with competency-based learning, it also changes the student engagement and motivation. So as I mentioned, we're having them select their own data set based off of their personal interests, right? So students tend to be a lot more engaged in the process because it's more relevant and meaningful to them, right? So if I've got someone that, maybe is working in insurance and they're having to analyze information on cars, that may not be interesting to them, right? Or relevant to them. So for them to come up with really good recommendations, it's going to be a harder struggle. versus letting them pick their own data sets. That's something that, they could look at insurance claims, and it's something that they can directly translate then into their current role and job. So take that learning and directly apply it to what they're doing. So it's going to be a lot more meaningful from that, right? And because of how they can progress, and I'm not focusing on this week is this week is that, they can really progress based on where they need to focus their time and efforts, right? They're still going to have to demonstrate mastery, but if it's something that they've done quickly or have done for 20 years, they can do that quickly, right? They could go through and do a project, and let's say they're use SQL every day at work. Well, they could do a SQL project, demonstrate their mastery, and maybe do that project in 2 or 3 hours because they're so well versed in it. Whereas someone that's never used SQL before, they might want to spend 2 weeks really understanding the basics of SQL and then demonstrating their mastery. And I might go through 2, 3 iterations of their project to help them really make sure that they've mastered it. Okay? So it changes that engagement level. And it also changes the motivation because they really want to understand something that they're interested in. And the motivation's not really focused more on really the grade. They're going to get there based off of how they're going to get there, right? So the flexibility also comes into, how I'm using the learning management systems. In my case, it's Canvas. So I can use those online platforms and use technology to really support that learning to make sure it's flexible and it's accessible, right? And it's getting away a lot more from the traditional setting in a classroom where we've got fixed schedules. And again, back to my case, since it's an online program, my program is 100% asynchronous, right? So there's not a set time that students have to join a classroom. And that's important because my program is mainly working professionals. So they need that flexibility in the learning environment because they're working, they're traveling, they've got, potentially kids, partners. So their schedule might be that, some students work Saturday and Sundays because that's when they're not working. Some might be working third shift, so they're working on class stuff during the day or at night. They need that flexibility to make sure that they can be successful. So when we talk about, and I jumped and talked a little bit about this, but I want to kind of set up more of a framework on how you would implement competency-based learning. And I'll kind of stop here for a second and go, once I cover this, my next step is I'm going to show you a case study and how I've really taken this knowledge and this pathway to implement it into a course. So the first step is to define those competencies. So you've got to understand what those key competencies are. For my program, that was based off of industry. They're going to finish their master's. If they're not already working in industry, they're going to industry. So I needed to understand what those key competencies were that industry expected students that had a master's in data analytics to have. Using those competencies, then I have to set clear learning outcomes, right? So out of the overall program, and then, what do they need to have for those learning outcomes when they finish that program? And then I'm going to use standards and frameworks. And I already saw this in a little bit of the chat with accreditation, industry standards. There's a lot of, great sources, but of what you have to follow between the standards and the frameworks. So it depends on, I'm in a school of business, so we have our own accreditation standards. There's a lot of great frameworks out there as well, too. So whatever's really relevant to your program. Then we design the curriculum. So once we know what those competencies are, right, and we know those learning outcomes, and we've got those based off of Bloom's taxonomy, what students need to just understand or remember versus what they need to be able to create and actually go and evaluate or assess. I'm going to create learning activities as I design the curriculum based off of each of those levels. And then I'm going to sequence all of my learning experiences. It's kind of a scaffolding approach throughout the entire curriculum. And I'm going to incorporate real-world applications as I design that curriculum so that students understand the theory, but then also how it actually applies. Then I'll develop the assessments. So my focus here is going to be more on the summative assessments, but with competency-based learning, I will still do some formative assessments. It's more about where I'm going to use those assessments, and I just want to use them wisely. So if I have certain things that I just want students to recall, understand, I can do quizzes for those, right? Because I can check that their basic understanding and recall. However, when it comes to actually applying things and applying them in the real world to actual data, I'm going to focus much more heavily on summative assessments. So I would estimate, without actually having measured these, probably 95%, well, let's say 90% probably of what I have in the program is more summative assessments. It's all project-based, hands-on real world. Now, we still do some formative assessments in terms of understanding with discussion posts and trying to get students engaged and showing how it's applying in different areas. But essentially, after the initial first course in the program, I've eliminated as many quizzes as possible. My goal is to not have any quizzes, and my goal is to not have any textbooks that they have to buy. I'm a firm believer in open educational resources, OER, because education is so expensive, but that's another topic. But I really want authentic assessments, right? Real world tasks. So I've worked with industry and my adjuncts that are working in industry to make sure that the assessments are based off of what they're actually going to be doing in industry. And then using personalized learning paths so that they've got flexible pacing. So we are still limited to the term. However, within that term, we shouldn't be that limited, right? Because everybody learns at different paces. So we want to encourage that flexibility within the curriculum. And individualized learning plans, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more when I talk about the case study. But essentially, I've taken this from a set 10-course master's program. It still is 10 courses, but now it's set at 6 courses so that everybody can meet the learning outcomes for the entire program. But now there's room for 4 additional courses so that students can tailor their program and they can add in a certificate, whether it's in artificial intelligence, big data, cybersecurity, project management, different areas. So we want them to be able to individualize what they're getting out of this graduate program. And now with the 30 credit hours within the program, they used to just get a master's in data analytics. Now they're getting a master's in data analytics, a graduate certificate in data analytics, and then another graduate certificate, if they choose, in one of those other graduate certificate areas. So they're ending up with 3 pieces of paper instead of just the one, so they can individualize what they get out of the program. As we design the courses in as well too, we've got to make sure that we're providing the support, the resources. So definitely academic support, we'll talk about more, learning resources. They've got everything they need to be successful within the course. They've got time, because we're giving them feedback, they've got time to reflect on what they're doing. And to me, the biggest part of this, once we kind of lay it all out really, is monitoring and evaluating the progress. As I mentioned, this is all back to quality, continuous improvement. We've got to track student performance, figure out where we need to make improvements, adjust the instruction, and we're continuously doing this so that we can evaluate the course effectiveness and make sure that, you know, we're making sure it's meeting the needs of our students so that they can be successful. So I want to talk more, and I know I kind of jumped a little bit ahead to the case study, It's kind of hard not to. I'm pretty excited. This has been my life for like the last 4 years since I joined the university, of really redesigning the curriculum and using the data to really drive what we're doing. So I'm going to talk initially about the entire program, but I'm going to then really focus more on what I did for one course that really kind of highlights what we're doing with competency-based learning. So my goal was to really redesign the program in a way that it was meeting the needs of industry, what they needed. And what I found was, our students come from such a wide background, as I mentioned. They could have 20, 30 years as a data analytics professional, or they could be changing careers and be completely brand new. So what we were finding throughout the program was that, some students, if they were well-versed, were, frankly, a little bit bored. And we weren't engaging them. They weren't getting what they needed out of it. So what I wanted to do based on the feedback was really level set everyone with a first course. And so we created an introductory course in data analytics that's a competency-based, self-paced, asynchronous course. All of the other courses in the program are set at 8 weeks. This course is now 16 weeks, but students can finish it as early as possible. So if they want to finish it in 8 weeks, then they can pick up another course. It just depends on their time availability, how motivated they are to move through the program, what their experiences are. But we really had to accommodate the diversity of our students, from people, again, that are very experienced to those without any prior knowledge, but create this course that I'm going to talk about that really level set everyone then. And what that allowed us to do was the 9 courses that were after that, we weren't spending the first 2 or 3 weeks of the course having to introduce this concept. They already had that base knowledge. And so we were able to take the subsequent classes in this program and really increase that level. So back to Bloom's taxonomy, I didn't have to start with that understand, remember level. I was able, because they were level set, to really jump into that higher level of knowledge, which really has made a difference in terms of what we're trying to do. So what we started out with for the entire program was we did a job skills analysis. So we did a very extensive analysis of looking at Indeed, Glassdoor, all the different job postings out there. And it was in the neighborhood of, I want to say, like over 80,000 job postings, where we basically analyzed all those job postings to figure out what were those job skills necessary for people are hiring data analysts. So that told us exactly what we needed in our program. So some of the questions that were in the chat, when we talk about competencies, that told us exactly what the competencies were, because this is what industry needs our students to have to be successful for a career in data analytics. So we took this information then, and I mapped it into our new program. And I won't spend too much time in this, but essentially I took the 10 courses, as I mentioned, took it down to 6 courses, and I mapped all of those different skills to each of those different courses. And then the capstone is basically that comprehensive, we're going to apply everything. And that's that final huge formative assessment of mastery, right? And so it's a scaffolding approach of how do I take these skills and continue to build upon them, so that even in Data Analytics 600, we're starting with quantitative analysis. We're doing things with business analytics and statistical data. But as I'm getting down further, then I'm taking that base knowledge and scaffolding it so I can cover more of the advanced statistical knowledge, right, that they're going to need to be successful. So using that information, then I'm going to talk now back to that first foundational course, excuse me, and highlight more of what we did from that perspective. Excuse me. So with this first course, we defined the competencies that they needed. So within this course, as I mentioned, this was level setting everyone in the program to make sure that they had that basic foundational knowledge to really kickstart their academic career and educational knowledge in data analytics. So I wanted to make sure that they understood the CRISP-DM methodology, which is a way of addressing, it's basically the scientific method for data analytics professionals. So they needed to understand how they were going to go after and attack any type of data analytics problem. So that was starting with a basic understanding. And then we started getting into really more of the competencies that they were going to have to show and illustrate. So data wrangling with Excel, analytical techniques, so making sure they had the proper statistics background, data visualization with Power BI, understanding relational databases with SQL, programming in R, and programming in Python. So within this 16-week course, they had, this was the focus of the competencies. And then I further broke down each of these competencies into really sub-competencies and what do I want them to get out of this. So when I mentioned this planning process, it's a pretty extensive planning process. And I've got an Excel spreadsheet that it's massive. But I'm going to show you some screenshots and kind of sample information, how I really kind of lay this out. So since this is, a lot of your quality professionals, I'm going to hone in more on competency 3, which was the analytical techniques and the statistics review. So each of those 7 competencies became a module in this course. So, oops, oh, sorry, make sure everybody's muted. So each of these modules then I have to elaborate on, right, and expand on. So I want them in this module to be able to perform basic inferential statistics, but then I have to break that down even further, right? So I've got more sub-learning outcomes. They need to understand and analyze data, prepare and organize data. But even from that, I need to break that down even more to make sure that we're outlining exactly what they want from this, right? So if I talk about perform inferential analysis and interpret the results, I'm talking about confidence intervals, determining sample sizes, explaining relationships between multiple variables, because this is going to really guide the content of the course so that I can make sure they have all those resources to be successful, right? So this is all back to all that information we've got to provide as we design the curriculum and design the courses to ensure that they can master that content. And as part of that, as I mentioned, I created a module for each of those competencies, and then I integrated real-world projects to provide the practical experience. So I essentially set this up so that each of those sub-modules then, I've mapped it to a content page in my course to make sure that I've adequately covered that material. So when I talk about recognizing the need for data, I've discussed this when I had my a content page on statistics, a content page on descriptive versus predictive versus prescriptive statistics, and some of the pitfalls with statistics. So I've mapped it out to make sure that I've addressed every single area. And so this was more for me to make sure that there wasn't an area that I wanted to make sure they understood they recognized the methods for data collection. If I didn't discuss this anywhere in my content in that module, then I've missed that content. This is a way of making sure that I covered this. And these numbers here simply tell me that it's a count to make sure that it's covered somewhere on that page, because this is a small portion of a spreadsheet that's quite long. So I'm just checking. I've got my checks and balances to make sure I've adequately covered everything. So within that, I started developing the assessments. So for this very first course, this is where I do have formative assessments. And again, I've tried to eliminate the formative assessments in every course after this. But what I wanted to do here was in each module, I created a readiness check. Did students really understand the content of that module? And I'm going to check that. If they understood that content, they're going to have a readiness check, a quiz, essentially, but we call it a readiness check. And once they've scored an 80% or higher on that readiness check, then it opens up the project. I don't want them just jumping into a project if they're really not ready. It's going to be demoralizing. It's going to not motivate them because they're going to be frustrated that they're trying to do a project where they didn't really understand the content first. So for each of those, and I try to highlight, in the same area, the same module, I developed a quiz bank. So for each of those sub-learning outcomes, I have at least 3 questions because a student's going to go through that module. They're going to take a quiz. If they don't get an 80% or higher, they're going to have to retake that quiz. It'll tell them go back and look at page whatever in the Canvas shell because they need to go back and re-study that material. So it gives them automatic feedback on where to go back and focus. They can't take that quiz for at least 24 more hours because we want to make sure they're actually taking the time to go back and understand that content. On the second time, hopefully they get an 80% or higher. If they do, then it opens up the project. If it doesn't open up the project, then they have to meet with me. And it's not a bad thing. It's okay, let's talk about what's happening here. So how are you going through the content to really understand it? Where are you struggling? Let me help you be successful. I want them to feel like, even though it's an asynchronous course, that they can reach out and I am here as a resource. So this is one of the ways of kind of forcing them to make that step if they don't feel comfortable. And so they don't go, oh, Dr. Cuddy's kind of scary. This is I am here to help you. What do you need? I want to set up this relationship with you now in the very first course, so you're going to be successful throughout the program, right? And you understand the resources that are available to you. So it's usually, and I mean, I haven't had it not be, it's a very open and great conversation about we are here and how do we work together, right? So the other part of this is because it's a quiz bank, when they do go back, they're going to see different questions, right? And so it helps with that mastery as well. So once they get that 80% or higher, it opens up the project. And that's our summative assessment. For the first module, it's a little bit different because that's a lower level on Bloom's taxonomy. As I mentioned, that's the CRISP-DN model. That's understanding how to go after and really attack a data analytics problem using more of a scientific method for that. So they're more describing the different phases of the CRISP-DN model. And so the evaluation there is they're going to write a post about how that's applicable, how it applies in their industry or based off of what they've done. So that one I'm evaluating more based off of their understanding of it. For the other 6 modules, the summative assessment is a project. They're going through, they've got real world data, they're analyzing it, they're interpreting it. So we're really focused on that critical analysis with a real world application where they're going to propose actual, actionable insights. They're going to make recommendations. They're given structured, unstructured data, various scenarios, just like they would be given in the real world. And the student can submit this as many times as possible to improve their grade. Every time they submit it, I'm giving them more feedback right? Until they've reached that mastery level. So the first time I'm grading them on absolutely everything that they've done. And then we're focusing on, okay, on step 3A of the project, whatever it might be, right? Let's go back and let's understand how you can improve this. And then they're going to resubmit based on those areas. And then I'm going to keep giving them feedback. So students can decide, if they get to a 98 on the project, that they're good enough. They're not going to try and get to that 100. But there's really no reason, except for, maybe they think they've done well enough, that they shouldn't get 100 on every single project. It just depends on how many times the students want to submit it. But it's all about guiding those improvements. And the final score in the course then is only based off of the projects, not on those quizzes. So I'm not using the formative assessment. That was more to make sure they were ready for the project. The summative assessment, because this is a graduate program, is what I'm more concerned with, right? And that's what industry wants. They want students to go and apply this. So we're emphasizing the mastery and the understanding of the tools. We're not focused on penalizing students for mistakes, right? Because I'm here to guide them and guide their improvements and guide their mastery of that topic. So with that, we've also set it up where it's a personalized learning path. So students, as I mentioned, there's those 7 modules. They all start with module 1 so that they understand that basic methodology for problem solving. But after that, they can pick any other module they want, module 2 through 7. So if a student, for example, knows they've got a lot of travel right now, they might pick a module that they already know very well because they can get through it quickly. And when they know they're going to have more dedicated time to focus on an area that they're not as comfortable with, then they can take that time. We really want them to really focus based on understanding their own schedule, their own needs, where they need to focus their improvements. The personalized learning path also comes in terms of the course duration of flexibility. So they do have the 16 weeks, but they can complete it as early as possible. I mean, I've had students that have worked in industry for 20 years. They can get through this course in, say, 4 weeks. Some might choose to take the 8 weeks just because, that's how their schedule works. And people that are brand new to data analytics might want to take the full 16 weeks because they want to make sure they really understand everything and take the time. So it's really tailored for anybody with a diverse background. So it's going to accommodate not only their level of experience, but their time, their own personal work schedules, their life schedules, things like that. The 5th step of that was providing support and resources. So within the course, I did a screenshot within it. As we cover each topic, they're given a data set that they can download and follow along with the videos. So for this one, for example, this was a page where I'm covering confidence intervals for a mean with an unknown standard deviation. So I have a video for every single topic. And they've got a data set so they can follow along and do the calculations with me. So they can have the video and they're actually creating it. And it might be a little bit harder to see, but essentially in here, I've got yellow cells. So they're going through and doing these calculations. And I'm not giving them the actual, they'll see the answer on the screen, but they're not actually getting the full answer in what they're downloading. So they've got to go through and follow along with the videos. And then I'm monitoring and evaluating their performance. So looking at where, like back to the formative assessments with the quizzes, I can see where students are struggling. So that'll tell me that, 20% of students are typically missing this question. Well, that's probably where I need to go back and maybe add a little bit more detail to the course. Students are struggling, so I've got the rubrics for the projects. I can see where students are typically having to resubmit projects based on, a certain part of the rubric. that's where I need to go back and really look at the content. One of the things I've done with my Excel spreadsheet as well is I've mapped it out to the outcomes and the rubrics so that I see exactly what pages that content's covered on, so I know exactly where to go back and make those improvements as well too. So what it's shown is, from the outcome standpoint, the flexibility has really been enhanced. Students seem to really be enjoying it because they can learn at their own pace. They can fit their studies around their personal and professional commitments. They're a lot more engaged because they're working on practical projects that are meaningful to them. So they're more engaged, they're more motivated. They're able to demonstrate their competency levels. And as I mentioned, they're creating professional portfolios. So they're able to take their mastery and how they've demonstrated their competency and show that to future employers or their current employers if they're trying to get a promotion, right? And show that they should be promoted based off of these skills, and move into management. The feedback has been very positive from students. So I wanted to show a little bit of the feedback, great course, easy to navigate, meeting on Zoom. So adding in the flexibility with it, I'm pretty happy to say in our teaching evaluations on a score of a 5-point scale, generally speaking, students are really pretty happy with this. They're enjoying the instruction, the readings that they have to do, the activities, the assignments, and their understanding level is there, applying concepts, it's enhancing their learning. They're engaged in the content. We're not doing as many discussions in this course, but really trying to improve that. There are some challenges though, right? And there's a lot of work that goes into setting this up. You really have to define those competencies. You've got to make sure you've got that alignment. And as I mentioned, I love a great spreadsheet. So I've got massive spreadsheets that have really outlined this so that I can use this, right? As quality professionals, and especially coming from the data analytics background, it's all in using that data to make sure that we're meeting the needs of our students, right? We're setting up assessments that are reliable, they're valid, so that we're really measuring students' competencies. And the challenge can be that we want to make sure that they're rigorous, but they're still fair, and we can gauge the skills and the knowledge of those students, right? We've also have to make sure that we've got the student support. So, making sure that they've got the right resources. So this is where I've gone back and created more videos, because sometimes it's a lot easier for students to hear as we go through and explain, why a problem is, we've got complex problems, why it's, we're interpreting it a certain way. So making sure students have access to the guidance and the support in the manner that they need, because we've got auditory learners, we've got kinesthetic learners, right? So making sure that we're addressing all those needs. From a data management standpoint, we've got a lot of data then that we can manage to use, but we've got to make sure that we're using it effectively to inform our instructional decisions, right? So seeing where students might be struggling, and how do we go back and add then what's appropriate to make sure. And luckily, because of how this course has been set up, and I don't do traditional office hours because my students are, all over the world, different time zones. I meet with them on one-on-one Zooms based on their availability. So it's mornings, evenings, weekends. They feel very comfortable telling me exactly what would be helpful. Like, it'd be great if we had maybe a flow chart on telling me how to, which method to pick. So they're telling me what would be useful so I can go back and add it to the course. And that's great, because I need that feedback to make sure it's helping everybody else out there, right? So some of the key takeaways from this is, I think competency-based learning is very useful when it comes to mastery of skills and knowledge. I don't know that it fits everything, right? For me, it works great for my program because of what my students need with the flexibility and pacing, more of that self-directed progress. And again, I've never worked in really secondary or primary education. I'm not sure how that would work. But from my perspective, it's really enhanced their engagement, their motivation, the competencies in terms of the real world applications, the projects that I'm getting. So this course went live last fall. So the projects that I've seen over the past year are leaps and bounds. I mean, really ahead of what I was seeing the year before. And it's not a negative on the previous students by any means. It's that the course wasn't set up in a way for them to take it to that next level. And we were asking them to take it to that next level. So they could have delivered it, but now the way that we've set up this course, they're able to deliver based off of that. And this iterative approach of working with students and guiding and mentoring students has really increased what they're able to do. And back to Bloom's taxonomy, I mean, now they're to that level where, I can definitely see that they're able to go out and hit the ground running with these projects. So it's very measurable improvements in terms of what I've seen in the mastery of data analytics skills. So a few final thoughts, and I definitely want to save some time for questions. And I know I get pretty passionate about talking about this. I know I'm running a little bit over. But to me, it's really about empowering students. We want students to be able to take control of their learning journey, right? In higher education, they're paying a lot of money to get this education. And so they really should have a say in terms of what they want to get out of it. Our role is to provide them with the skills and knowledge so that they're going to be successful and help guide them in their learning journey so they're going to be successful with where they want to go, right? And I think the future of education is looking at a transformative approach so that we can align the demands of the workforce that are going to hire our students from higher education. And we need to make sure that they're equipped and they're well equipped so they can meet those future challenges, right? And so to me, it's all about the commitment to excellence and really quality in education so that we're improving our educational practices so that we're supporting student success. We're doing a student-centered approach, and it's part of that lifelong journey for them of really making sure that they're successful. And so with that, I want to thank you all and kind of open it up. And Cameron and Ray, do we have time for a couple of questions?
Absolutely. Yeah. The floor is now open for any questions that you may have. Yeah, you can also unmute yourself.
And I'm going through. Oh, yeah, perfect. Yeah, feel free to unmute yourself. And I'm going through a couple of the chats, right? Comments. Because there's been some great comments in the chat. I was trying to hit those as I was talking about them, but and I agree. So Aram made a comment about students' feedback and involvement, if taken positively, plays a vital role in teaching. And absolutely. I think I'm fortunate as in higher education, and this is a master's program. Typically, if you're in a graduate program, you're taking your program pretty seriously, right? You're paying for that, or your employer's paying for that. And it could be very different than, I'll say maybe an English 101 class. It's a core class that everybody has to take. But students are in my program typically because they want to be. So it's a little bit different, right? I'm fortunate from that perspective.
Well, before we start the question answers, just few questions or comments from my side, Beth. Okay. It was really an excellent presentation, and I think very insightful coverage that you have given. In this part of the world, we sometimes use the word outcome-based education for competency-based learning, So sometimes this alternate word, Higher Education Commission, for example, in our country, has made it mandatory for all and Abbott also, and Washington Accord also is using the word outcome-based education. So is that your competency-based learning in aligned with the Washington Accord or Abbott-based outcome-based learning? Is that the similar thing you're talking?
Yes, I think it's very similar. The only differentiation might be that, so we're taking the competencies to develop those outcomes, right? Which you are as well too, right? I mean, your outcomes come from based on those competencies that they need. So I think it's more just a slight differentiation in terminology.
And you mentioned a very important aspect was job skill analysis, which you carried out. And I noticed that most of the skills that you presented were technical skills, not the soft skills. Whereas initially, when we talked about the competencies, we said there are also requirement of soft skills or management skills or those types of skills. How do you cover those aspects in this framework that you have developed?
Oh, absolutely. That's a great question. So it's interesting because when we did the job skills analysis, it was more on the technical skills, definitely. But we realized that you can do a great analysis and you can come up with great recommendations, but if you can't communicate them, then it's meaningless, right? And so we took that into ours as part of when we set up all of the competencies and our learning outcomes. We tied in all the communication and teamwork and all of those other softer skills into those as well too. So while they weren't picked up on the job skills analysis, we still incorporated them because we knew that was a mandatory requirement for our students to be successful.
So in that case,
absolutely.
Yeah, in that case, the rubric that you have mentioned should include the soft skills assessment as well, right?
Absolutely. Yes. So we, on all of our projects, part of the rubric is effective communication. So if it's a report, it's is there written communication effectively conveying the information? If they have to we'll have them do also video presentations where they'll go through and present verbally what their key findings are, as if they're presenting to senior management or team leaders. And then we're also evaluating them in the rubric based on how they effectively convey it verbally as well. So we've got different summative assessments, whether it's written communication or verbal communication, and that's built into all of those rubrics.
And you put in your project
great question.
Quite heavy emphasis on the project, the final project you said. And how do you make sure that their final project is not AI developed, not by the students?
Yes, that's a great question. So AI is really interesting right now. So one of the ways, and granted, I mean, if a student really still wanted to use AI, they're still going to find a way to write their report with AI. However, I feel like we've made it a lot more difficult. So a student has to go through, so the first course, I should say, all the projects are set, but the remaining 5 courses, they go find their own project, their own data set. So they've got to go through and come up with a data dictionary for their project. They go through, they've got to clean their own data. They've got to decide what analysis they're going to use for that data set. So it's pretty hard for AI to write that report and do all their analysis that they've got to do. So they're going to create, so let's say in like the data mining course, they're going to go through and create a random forest model using their data. So they pick their own data set, they create their data dictionary, they come up with their own question. This is, based on my experience, what I want to try and answer with this question. This is how I organize my data. This is how I set up my research questions. And then they create the code, go through and do all of their analysis. Right? And then they come up with their recommendations based off of it. They've got to check the accuracy of their models, right? So, I mean, they could use AI, and I do encourage them, if they're stuck on their code, like go to ChatGPT. Like if you're getting this error and you don't know what it is, rather than spending 3 hours staring at this code, driving yourself crazy, put your code in AI and in ChatGPT and figure out where the error is coming from. Because oftentimes it's like a missing comma or semicolon, and it stresses them out. Like, so use it, right, for its benefits. And if you're having trouble kind of coming up with some, strategies, you can use it to go, well, what does this really mean? But it's not doing all of your work for you, right? You still have to come up with your actionable insights based off this data and this analysis. ChatGPT can't do all that for you. It's the junk in, junk out. It's not going to make sense, right? When you go through their whole project, and it's going to be pretty clear that you asked this question, but at the end, your recommendations were this. That doesn't align with your whole analysis, right? So you can see it pretty clearly. And because of how we're doing this iterative approach, then that's me going back to them and saying, well, why did you say you should do this? I don't see this recommendation based off of any of your charts and graphs that you created, right?
Yeah.
So explain this to me.
Okay, Ray, go ahead with the questions of the participants.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Very, very nice conversations, Dr. Cameron and Dr. Beth. I can see in here from Mosen, which taxonomy is used to develop rubrics for skills development as compared to knowledge in your experience?
So I think that, so it depends. So I'm using Bloom's taxonomy was used to create all the learning objectives and the sub-objectives. And then using that information, that's how I created the rubrics. So based off of what I wanted out of it. So if I wanted them with just a basic understanding, which didn't happen often, then I would set up my rubric at my 5 levels for my rubric based on what I'm trying for them to do. And let's see. I'm going to share my screen really quickly if that's okay. So for example, so this is my massive, when I mentioned that I've got my different modules and how I'm tracking everything. So for example, module 3, I've got all of my different sub modules and where I'm covering it. And then over here, I'm tracking how many readiness questions I've got, my project questions, and then I've based my rubric based off of what I'm trying to do. So for example, if I want them to explain relationships between multiple variables using quantitative data, for that project, I'm asking them to do this in parts B4, B5, and B6. And then I've got my rubrics based off of it. So they get full points if they thoroughly analyze the quantitative data to identify and explain relationships between that, if they more competently did it, but they lack depth in interpretations. So I've tried to link each learning objective with each rubric so that it goes straight across. And then I'm measuring exactly what I need. And based off of that, let's say I start seeing a lot of students that are scoring in the needs improvement area, I know where I need to go back based on where I'm covering this information to make improvements in my content in the course to help guide my students and provide them with better information. So hopefully that makes sense. But it's all kind of linking that, and that's how I can use the data based on their performance to know exactly where to go back and make those improvements.
Okay. Thank you for that. Beth, there's maybe one more question that we can accommodate at this point from Iram. When talking about traditional teaching, does the age gap between the instructor and students matter?
I don't think so. I hope not. So I'm kind of going back from a more of a maybe a philosophical standpoint, is it shouldn't matter if there's an age gap between the instructor and the students. You know, I work with students from all different ages. There's a great book out there that I'm going to mention called Gentelligence that I've really enjoyed. I've been digging into because I think then it becomes more about how do you communicate with different people. So it's we had a great speaker on campus, the author of Gentelligence last spring. And for me, it's more about how do you communicate between the different age groups, right? So if I want to work with a student that might be, you know, went straight from their bachelor's to their master's and they're 22 years old, the way that I'm going to try and understand where they're struggling might be different than how I'm going to ask questions to somebody that's, you know, maybe a student that's 60 years old that is trying to, you know, switch careers or get more into this later in their career. I mean, so it's more about how do I effectively communicate to anybody, right? And as an instructor, as an educator, that's really kind of the biggest part, is not so much the age gap, is how do we engage anyone and be able to communicate and effectively have that conversation so that they're going to be successful. Yeah.
Okay. Maybe one last question, Dr. Beth, from Dr. Madera. In handling diverse students, how do we ensure that we teachers are responsive to their needs?
So that is a great question. That is, to me, I think one of the harder aspects, because our students are so diverse. To me, I think the biggest thing that we can do is as educators is be approachable, right? Our students aren't going to tell us what they need if they don't feel comfortable telling us what they need. We're not mind readers. And we have our own bias that we bring to the table, right? On how we think things should be presented to students. So definitely going through, trying to understand anything that we can do in the classroom around diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. Most learning management systems have ways to do checks to make sure that what we're presenting in our content is accessible content. So whether we're providing alt text so that students that need other understanding, and then we're providing content in as many ways as possible so it addresses all of those learning styles, is really important so that we can be responsive as possible. Open door policies. But I set the stage initially in all of my classes. I try to, as much as possible, as making sure students know that I'm here for their success. I'm here to support them. And I can only do what I know about. So I need them to tell me. One thing that we also do that I'm really appreciative about is we don't just do an end of semester course evaluation. We do a 3-week course evaluation, which I think is essential. So 3 weeks in, if things aren't working for you, you have an opportunity to anonymously provide feedback as well. So students that may not feel that comfortable coming forward can provide that feedback. And 3 weeks in, that gives me plenty of time to take that feedback and make changes so that I can help students. So if you're not doing that within your universities, I highly recommend it.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Beth, for really insightful and really inspiring presentation. Your expertise and your practical examples have certainly provided us that valuable knowledge on redesigning education through Lean Six Sigma. By the way, before we wrap up, everyone, we would greatly appreciate your feedback on today's webinar. Your inputs help us continuously improve and tailor our future events to better meet your needs. And please take a moment, if you can scan a QR code, as you can see right here on the screen, or if you can click on the link that I shared right here in our chat box, that would be amazing to complete our quick survey. Your feedback definitely is important to us. So we would also want to remind everyone about our next EduTalks session, which will take place on October 17th. Mark your calendars as we will continue to explore other topics or cutting edge topics and bring you more experts in the field of quality in education. With that, I want to say thank you to all of you for joining us today and for your active participation. We look forward to seeing you at our next EduTalks. Have a great day. Take care, everyone. Dr. Kamran, do you want to say quick message before we close our
I
webinar for today?
Yes, I think it was an excellent webinar, Beth. On behalf of all the participants, we like to thank you. I think this topic is becoming very important day by day, and universities are basically working on it and struggling to overcome this thing. And I think your lecture and your presentation has been very valuable in that aspect. Now, one of the problem that I see is, as you presented only one course, if you look at the whole program, there are a number of other instructors. And the learning outcome of the whole program is, not every instructor is with the same competencies. So one of the challenge that I am taking with me is what are the competencies required in instructors to deliver the competencies-based learning. So just a little comment and that we will close this webinar.
Yes. And just a quick comment to that. Luckily, we have master course shells. So once this course is developed, everyone follows it. And that way we reduce the variation, right? And we ensure consistency.
And even
so it doesn't matter who teaches it.
Yeah, even from the competency base, one of the great thing I think which is required is the job skill analysis by the teachers. If they do it properly, I think it will guide a lot of things, how to develop and how to cover up various aspects, So with this, thank you very much, Dr. Beth. It's been an excellent presentation from different countries. People are now enjoying this session, and they are relevant also to this topic as well. So with this,
thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you very much. With this great talk, I think we conclude. And for everyone, we will wait for our next EduTalk session coming in October, Ray. It's
October
in October
17th.
October
Yes.
17th will be our next session. And we all hope to see you all there. Thank you very much, Beth and everyone. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.